On a crisp autumn evening in a suburban town in the United States, 17-year-old Maya Johnson was driving home from a late study session at the library. The streets were quiet, illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights. Maya, an African-American honors student with aspirations of attending a prestigious university, was focused on her future. Her father, James Johnson, a respected community leader and former Marine, had always emphasized the importance of education and integrity. As Maya approached an intersection, she noticed the flashing red and blue lights of a police car in her rearview mirror. Her heart raced as she pulled over to the side of the road, unsure of what she had done wrong. Two white police officers, Officer Daniels and Officer Miller, approached her vehicle with stern expressions. "License and registration," Officer Daniels demanded curtly. Maya's hands trembled slightly as she retrieved her documents. "May I ask why I was pulled over, sir?" she inquired politely. Officer Miller glanced at his partner before responding. "We've had reports of a stolen vehicle matching this description." Maya's eyes widened in disbelief. "This is my car. I can assure you it's not stolen." Without further explanation, Officer Daniels opened the driver's door and ordered Maya to step out. Confused and frightened, she complied. The officers roughly pulled her from the car, causing her to stumble. They forced her hands behind her back and placed her in handcuffs. "Please, this is a misunderstanding," Maya pleaded, tears streaming down her face. Ignoring her protests, the officers pushed her against the patrol car. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into her wrists. Passers-by slowed their cars to gawk at the scene, but no one intervened. Meanwhile, James Johnson was at home, preparing dinner and awaiting his daughter's return. When he received a frantic call from a friend who had witnessed the incident, he felt a surge of panic. Without hesitation, he grabbed his coat and rushed to the location described. Arriving at the scene, James saw his daughter in distress, surrounded by the officers. His military training kicked in, and he approached calmly but assertively. "Excuse me, officers," he called out, his voice steady. "That's my daughter. What's going on here?" Officer Daniels turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "Sir, please step back. We're handling a situation here." James took a deep breath, suppressing his anger. "I understand, but I assure you there's been a mistake. This is our family car, and my daughter has done nothing wrong." Officer Miller glanced at Maya, then back at James. "Do you have proof of ownership?" James nodded and pulled out his phone, accessing the digital records of the car's registration and insurance. He handed the phone to Officer Miller, who scrutinized the documents. After a tense moment, Officer Miller sighed and nodded to his partner. They removed the handcuffs from Maya, who immediately ran into her father's arms, sobbing. "We're sorry for the inconvenience," Officer Daniels muttered, avoiding eye contact. James held his daughter tightly, his eyes narrowing at the officers. "An inconvenience? You traumatized my daughter based on a baseless assumption. This is unacceptable." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, but remained silent. James took Maya by the hand and led her to their car. As they drove home, he couldn't shake the anger and frustration boiling inside him. He knew this incident was not just a simple mistake, but a reflection of a deeper, systemic issue. That night, as Maya sat quietly at the dinner table, James made a silent vow to seek justice and ensure that no other family in their community would have to endure such an ordeal. The following morning, the Johnson household was enveloped in a heavy silence. Maya, usually vibrant and talkative, sat quietly at the breakfast table, her eyes downcast. James watched her, his heart aching for his daughter. "Maya," he began gently, "I know last night was traumatic, but we need to talk about what happened." She looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Dad, why did they treat me like that? I didn't do anything wrong." James sighed, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes people make judgments based on appearances rather than facts. It's unfair and unjust, but it happens. What's important now is how we respond. Maya nodded slowly, absorbing her father's words. What can we do? First, James said, we need to file a formal complaint against the officers involved. They need to be held accountable for their actions. Maya hesitated. Will that really make a difference? James reached across the table, taking her hand. It might not change the past, but it can help prevent this from happening to someone else, and it sends a message that we won't stand for injustice. Later that day, James and Maya visited the local police department to file their complaint. They were met with bureaucratic indifference, but James remained steadfast, ensuring that their voices were heard. As news of the incident spread through the community, support began to pour in. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers reached out to the Johnsons, offering words of encouragement and solidarity. The local newspaper ran a story highlighting the incident, sparking a broader conversation about racial profiling, and the morning after the incident, Maya woke to sunlight streaming through her bedroom window, but it brought her no comfort. Her mind replayed the scene again and again, the flashing red and blue lights, the cold metal of the handcuffs, the accusatory tone in the officers' voices. It felt like a bad dream, except it wasn't. It was real. Downstairs, James Johnson, her father, sat at the kitchen table, his hands folded, his face thoughtful but tense. A man who had spent years serving his country as a Marine, James had learned to handle difficult situations with resolve. But this was different. This wasn't an enemy on foreign soil. This was home. And home had failed his daughter. When Maya finally came downstairs, her steps were slow, her eyes weary. James looked up and offered her a small, encouraging smile. "Morning, sweetheart," he said gently, pouring her a glass of orange juice. "Morning, Dad," Maya replied softly, sitting down across from him. She stared at the glass but didn't touch it. There was a heavy silence between them. James waited, knowing that his daughter would speak when she was ready. Finally, she broke the quiet. "Dad, I don't understand." Maya's voice was small, trembling. "Why did they think I stole my own car? Why did they treat me like that?" James's jaw tightened, his fists clenching unconsciously. He took a deep breath to steady himself. "Because of the way you look, Maya," he admitted, his voice steady but laced with anger. "Because they saw a young black girl driving a nice car, and they didn't bother to ask questions. They assumed. They judged. And they acted." Maya's face fell. "But that's not fair," she whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. "I didn't do anything wrong. I've always followed the rules." James got up and moved to her side, kneeling so they were at eye level. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You're right. It's not fair," he said. "And it's not your fault. But this is the world we live in. Some people see your skin before they see you. But that doesn't mean we stop fighting for what's right. It means we fight harder." Maya wiped at her tears with the back of her hand. "What can we do, Dad? They don't care. The officers didn't even apologize." "We hold them accountable," James said firmly, standing tall once again. "We file a complaint. We tell our story. And we make sure people hear it, because this cannot happen again. Not to you, and not to anyone else." That afternoon, James drove Maya to the police station. The building loomed large and imposing, its gray walls reflecting the coldness Maya felt in her chest. She hesitated as they approached the front doors. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready," James said, noticing her hesitation. Maya took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and nodded. "No, Dad. I want to do this." Inside, the receptionist directed them to an officer responsible for handling complaints. A middle-aged man in a wrinkled uniform greeted them with a forced smile, clearly unprepared for the level of intensity in James's gaze. "We're here to file a formal complaint against Officers Daniels and Miller," James said without preamble. The officer glanced at the paperwork in front of him and sighed. Of course. Why don't you have a seat and give me the details? James and Maya sat down, and James recounted the incident with precise detail, his voice unwavering. Maya added her own account, though her voice shook at times. The officer scribbled notes but offered little reaction. When James finished, he leaned forward. We expect this complaint to be taken seriously. I'll be following up to ensure action is taken. The officer nodded stiffly. We'll review the matter internally, sir. James's eyes narrowed. Internally? And how often does internally lead to change? The officer looked uncomfortable. We'll do our best, Mr. Johnson. Your best isn't good enough, James replied sharply. I want confirmation that these officers will be investigated. This isn't over. By the next day, news of Maya's experience had spread through the community. James had reached out to several friends and community leaders, and before long, the story appeared on social media. People began to share Maya's experience, using it as a rallying point to call out the systemic issues of racial profiling that had plagued their town for years. Support poured in from neighbors, teachers, and even strangers. Maya's phone buzzed constantly with messages of encouragement. Still, the incident left her shaken. She struggled to concentrate at school, and the once familiar streets felt hostile and unsafe. One afternoon, Maya's best friend, Aaliyah, sat beside her at lunch and asked quietly, "How are you holding up?" Maya shrugged, pushing her food around her tray. "I don't know. I just keep thinking, what if my dad hadn't shown up? What if things had gone worse? I was so scared, Aaliyah." Aaliyah squeezed Maya's hand. "You don't have to be scared anymore. Your dad's fighting for you. We all are." Maya nodded, but deep down, she wondered if one voice, or even many, would be enough to make a difference. The officers were still on duty, and the thought of seeing them again made her stomach turn. That evening, James sat down with Maya in the living room. "I've been speaking with a civil rights attorney," he told her. "We're going to take this as far as we need to, not just for you, but for everyone who's been treated this way." Maya looked at him, her eyes wide. "Do you really think we can change anything, Dad?" James smiled faintly. "Change doesn't happen overnight, sweetheart, but we can plant a seed, and that's how it starts." For the first time since the incident, Maya felt a small spark of hope. Her father's determination was unshakable, and maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to make a difference. The days following Maya's traumatic encounter felt both overwhelming and surreal. Her story had taken on a life of its own. It began with whispers among neighbors and classmates, but soon it spread far beyond their small town. Social media platforms lit up with messages of support, anger, and calls for justice. The Johnsons' doorbell rang constantly, with reporters asking for interviews, local activists offering solidarity, and neighbors bringing meals and notes of encouragement. Maya sat in her room scrolling through her phone, watching her story go viral. Hashtags like "You Justice for Maya" and "You Just Stop Racial Profiling" trended on Twitter. Videos of her father, James, speaking outside the police station circulated online, his words steady and full of righteous anger. "My daughter did nothing wrong, yet she was treated like a criminal. This isn't just about Maya. It's about every black child who fears for their safety just for existing." But with the support came backlash. Some people online dismissed the incident, blaming Maya for looking suspicious or accusing James of seeking attention. Maya read the comments late into the night, their words cutting deep. She must have done something to provoke it. Her dad's just playing the race card. Maybe the police were right to pull her over. Who knows? Tears burned her eyes as she put her phone down. It didn't matter that she was an honor student, that she'd done everything right. People still believed she was at fault. For the first time, she felt the world didn't care who she truly was. Meanwhile, James wasn't sitting still. True to his word, he met with a civil rights attorney named Regina Lawson. Regina was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her early 40s, known for her work in holding law enforcement accountable for misconduct. When she arrived at the Johnsons' home, she immediately put James and Maya at ease with her calm confidence. "I'm going to be honest with you," Regina said, setting down a thick file of papers. "Cases like this aren't easy. The department will fight back, they'll deflect blame, and they'll try to paint Maya in a negative light." James nodded. "I've been through battles before, Ms. Lawson. I'm not afraid to fight this one." Regina smiled. "Good. Because I believe we can win, not just in court, but in the court of public opinion. This case can expose the biases that led to this incident and force changes in how law enforcement operates in this town." "Do you think the officers will be held accountable?" Maya asked quietly, sitting beside her father. Regina paused, looking at Maya with understanding. "It's possible, but accountability doesn't always come in the way we hope. However, shining a light on the truth, that's the first step. Are you ready for this, Maya? It won't be easy." Maya hesitated. The thought of reliving that night, answering questions, and being judged again terrified her. But then she remembered the look on her father's face when he had arrived to save her. The fierce love and determination. She owed it to herself, to her family, and to others like her. "I'm ready," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "Pourquoi?" Regina wasted no time. She filed an official complaint not just with the local police department, but also with the state civil rights board. She called for an independent investigation into the officers' actions, accusing them of racial profiling and misconduct. The case quickly drew attention from civil rights groups and local news outlets, sparking protests outside the police station. One afternoon, Maya and James stood on the sidelines of a peaceful protest. Hundreds of people gathered, holding signs that read, "End racial profiling" and "Justice for Maya." Activists, pastors, students, and parents all took turns speaking on the small stage that had been set up. Maya shifted nervously as someone handed her a microphone. "They want you to say something," James said gently, encouraging her. "I don't know what to say, Dad." "Say how you feel. That's enough." Taking a deep breath, Maya stepped onto the stage. The crowd quieted, all eyes on her. The weight of their attention was heavy, but she stood tall. "My name is Maya Johnson," she began, her voice shaky, but growing stronger with every word. "A week ago, I was pulled out of my car, handcuffed, and treated like a criminal because of the way I look. I didn't do anything wrong, but that didn't matter to the officers who saw me. It didn't matter that I'm a student, a daughter, or a human being. They only saw one thing: my skin." The crowd murmured in agreement. Maya paused, gathering her thoughts. "I'm standing here today because I refuse to let fear silence me. What happened to me wasn't just a mistake. It's part of a bigger problem that we can't ignore anymore. I want to live in a world where no one has to be afraid of the people who are supposed to protect us." Applause erupted, people chanting her name. "Maya, Maya!" She stepped off the stage, shaking with emotion but filled with pride. Her father wrapped her in a hug. "I'm proud of you," James whispered. "You were brave up there." That evening, at the police station, tensions reached a boiling point. Officers Daniels and Miller were placed on administrative leave while the investigation continued, but the chief of police held a press conference defending their actions. "Our officers acted in accordance with protocol," he said, his voice firm. "The car in question matched the description of a stolen vehicle. This wasn't about race, it was about ensuring public safety." The Johnsons watched the press conference from home, anger bubbling in James's chest. "Protocol. They dragged my daughter out of her car and cuffed her like she was dangerous." Maya looked at him, her voice quiet but steady. They're going to keep defending themselves no matter what, Dad. James turned to her, determination blazing in his eyes. Then we'll keep fighting. They want to brush this under the rug? We'll make sure it stays in the light for everyone to see. That night, James sat at his desk, drafting an open letter to the community. It was time for the people to understand the truth, not just about Maya's experience, but about the deeper injustices that had simmered beneath the surface for far too long. The day after the police press conference, the atmosphere in the Johnson household was heavy. James paced back and forth in the living room, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, while Maya sat silently on the couch, her knees pulled up to her chest. The words of the police chief echoed in their minds. This wasn't about race, it was about ensuring public safety. Protocol, James muttered bitterly, stopping to stare out the window. It's always the same excuse. They think they can justify this nonsense, sweep it under the rug, and move on. Maya looked up, her voice small. Doesn't anyone believe us, Dad? James turned to face her, his expression softening as he sat beside her. A lot of people believe us, sweetheart. But there are those who don't want to see the truth because it's easier for them to look away. Then what's the point of fighting if nothing's going to change? James placed a hand on her shoulder, looking her in the eyes. The point is that we can't let them win. If we stay silent, we give them permission to treat someone else the same way. You were brave to stand up and speak at that protest. Now, we keep going. Change doesn't happen overnight. That morning, James's open letter to the community appeared in the local newspaper and online news platforms. It was a powerful statement, written with passion and clarity, outlining Maya's experience and calling for accountability, transparency, and reform. What happened to my daughter was not an isolated incident. It is part of a system that too often judges people by their skin color, not their actions. If we ignore this, we are complicit. If we speak up, we can make this community safer for everyone, not just for my family, but for yours too. The letter sparked a wildfire of reactions. Supporters flooded social media with messages of solidarity, while critics accused James of stirring division. The local news ran debates, featuring pundits arguing over whether Maya's treatment was reasonable or unacceptable. James received anonymous letters, some encouraging, others hateful. One morning, as he opened the mailbox, he found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a note that read, "Stop pushing your agenda, or there will be consequences." James frowned as he held the note in his hands, a cold anger creeping into his chest. He wouldn't show it to Maya. He didn't want to frighten her. Instead, he went to his desk, placed the letter in a drawer, and picked up the phone to call Regina Lawson. Regina arrived at the Johnson house later that afternoon, her presence as commanding as always. She examined the anonymous letter carefully before looking up at James. "This is intimidation," she said firmly. "It's meant to scare you into backing off." James leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "It's not going to work." "I know it won't," Regina replied. "But we need to be careful. When you challenge a system like this, people fight back, sometimes ugly." "What do you think we should do?" James asked. "First, I'll make sure law enforcement knows about this letter. They'll claim it's unrelated, but it's important to have it on record. Second, I think we need to take this case public in a bigger way. We have enough evidence to show that Maya's civil rights were violated, and with the right legal and public pressure, we can push this to court." James nodded. "I'm ready." Regina looked at him seriously. "Are you sure?" "This won't be easy, James. The department will dig into your family's life. They'll look for anything they can use to discredit you and Maya." "I've been through worse," James said. "I won't let them win." As the legal process gained momentum, so did the tension in the town. Lines were drawn. Some community members rallied around the Johnson family, calling for justice and reform, while others defended the officers, arguing that they had only been doing their jobs. At school, Maya felt the strain firsthand. Though many of her classmates supported her, others whispered behind her back. One afternoon, as she walked down the hallway, a boy muttered loud enough for her to hear, "Drama queen, she just wants attention." Maya froze, her heart pounding. She turned to face him, her voice shaking with controlled anger. "Do you think being dragged out of your car in handcuffs is fun? Do you think I asked for any of this?" The boy looked caught off guard, mumbling something under his breath before walking away. Maya blinked back tears and hurried to the bathroom, locking herself in a stall. Later that evening, as she sat at the dinner table, Maya asked quietly, "Dad, is it always going to be this hard, just because of who we are?" James set down his fork and looked at her, his expression full of both sadness and pride. "It shouldn't be, and that's why we're fighting. You may not see it yet, but you're changing things, Maya. Just by standing up, you're making a difference." Days turned into weeks, and the legal case began to take shape. Regina filed a lawsuit against the police department, accusing officers Daniels and Miller of violating Maya's civil rights through unlawful detention and racial profiling. The lawsuit demanded accountability, policy changes, and a public apology. The police department responded with a defensive statement, claiming the officers had acted within reasonable suspicion. They refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing. Meanwhile, news outlets from across the state picked up the story. The Johnson family received requests for interviews from national networks. Regina encouraged them to accept, explaining that public attention could add pressure to the case. Sitting on the set of a national news broadcast, Maya felt her palms sweat as the bright lights and cameras focused on her. Her father sat beside her, offering a reassuring nod. The interviewer, a composed woman with a sharp gaze, began gently, "Maya, can you tell us how this experience has affected you?" Maya swallowed hard, then spoke. "It changed the way I see the world. I always thought if I worked hard and followed the rules, I'd be treated fairly. But that night, I learned that's not always true, and that's not okay." The interviewer turned to James. "Mr. Johnson, what do you hope to accomplish with this lawsuit?" James's voice was firm. "I want justice for my daughter, but more than that, I want change. I want the police to be held accountable when they abuse their power. And I want every black child to know they don't have to live in fear just for being who they are." The clip aired that evening, sparking both admiration and controversy. To the Johnson supporters, they were heroes fighting a broken system. To their detractors, they were troublemakers stirring unrest. The battle lines had been drawn, but James and Maya were ready to stand their ground. For Maya, the fear and humiliation of that night still lingered, but so did a new sense of purpose. This fight wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the countless others who had been silenced, ignored, and denied justice. And no matter how hard it got, she wouldn't back down. The lawsuit sent shockwaves through the town. For the first time, people were forced to confront what had happened to Maya and what it represented. Supporters of the Johnson family organized rallies, urging the police department to take responsibility, while their detractors grew louder, accusing the Johnsons of slandering good officers and dividing the community. News trucks were parked outside the Johnsons' modest home, their cameras capturing every coming and going. James and Maya had grown used to the constant attention, but it wasn't easy. James noticed his daughter's forced smiles when neighbors waved, or the way her shoulders tensed when people whispered as they walked past. The police department's public relations team launched a counter-narrative, painting the officers as hard-working men who had followed protocol. They released body cam footage to support their version of events, but the footage only intensified the controversy. Regina Lawson sat with James and Maya in their living room, her laptop open, replaying the footage. The video showed Maya sitting in the driver's seat, calm and compliant. Officer Daniel's voice was sharp as he barked at her to exit the car. The footage captured the sound of her stammering, "I don't understand. This is my car." Then came the jarring image of Daniels pulling her out forcefully. Regina paused the video. "They think this makes them look good," she said dryly. "It doesn't." James leaned back, shaking his head in disbelief. "They're trying to justify it, like manhandling a teenager who did nothing wrong is acceptable because of protocol." Maya sat quietly, staring at the frozen image of herself on the screen. "I didn't do anything to deserve that," she whispered, her voice tight. Regina turned to her. "You didn't, and that's what we're going to prove in court." James clenched his fists. "We can't let them win this PR battle. We need the community to see that this is about more than just Maya. It's about a system that allows this kind of treatment to happen." Regina nodded. "We'll organize a community meeting. We need to remind people what this fight is really about: justice, accountability, and change." The following week, the Johnsons and their allies hosted a town hall meeting at the local community center. The room was packed. Residents, activists, clergy members, and even a handful of police officers filled the space. On one side sat supporters holding signs that read, "Justice for Maya," and "End Racial Profiling." On the other side were skeptics and detractors, their arms crossed, their expressions guarded. James stood at the podium, his voice calm but firm. "We're not here to attack the police," he began, scanning the room. "We're here to hold them accountable. I served my country as a Marine for over 20 years. I believe in honor, integrity, and justice. But what happened to my daughter was none of those things." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This isn't just about Maya. This is about every child, every parent, and every person in this town who wants to trust the people sworn to protect us. That trust has been broken, and we need to fix it." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, though a few voices muttered objections. Then Maya stepped forward. She was nervous, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "My name is Maya Johnson," she began, her voice quiet but clear. "I've lived in this town my whole life. I'm a good student. I'm a good person. But that didn't matter the night I was pulled out of my car and handcuffed for no reason. The officers didn't see me. They saw what they wanted to see. And that's the problem." She glanced at the police officers seated in the back, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to ask for change. I don't want anyone else to go through what I did." The room fell silent for a moment before erupting into applause. James placed a proud hand on her shoulder as she stepped back. Not everyone clapped. A man near the back of the room stood up, his voice loud and angry. The police were doing their jobs. Maybe if she hadn't been driving a car that looked suspicious, this wouldn't have happened. Gasps echoed through the room. Maya flinched, but James stepped forward. "My daughter doesn't look suspicious. She looks like your daughters, your nieces, your neighbors," James said, his voice steady but cutting. "What's suspicious about a young black girl driving home after studying at the library?" The man sat down, grumbling under his breath, while others in the crowd nodded in agreement. "Edithu!" And outside the community center, reporters swarmed, capturing the Johnsons' every word. Maya stood quietly as James answered questions. A journalist asked, "Mr. Johnson, do you think the town is divided because of this lawsuit?" James shook his head. The town was already divided. This lawsuit is just bringing those divisions to light. We have a choice to make. We can let fear and ignorance keep us apart, or we can face the truth and work towards something better. As they walked to their car, a group of teenagers approached Maya. One of them, a black girl she recognized from school, smiled shyly. "Thank you for speaking up," the girl said softly. My brother was stopped last year for no reason. He didn't tell anyone because he was scared. You're really brave. Maya blinked, surprised. I didn't feel brave. But you are, the girl insisted. You're standing up for all of us. The words stayed with Maya as they drove home. For the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope, like maybe, just maybe, her voice was making a difference. That night, James sat at his desk, looking through old photos of Maya. Her 5th grade graduation, her first soccer game, her honor roll certificates. He thought about the life he wanted for her. A life where she could drive down the street without fear, where her skin wasn't seen as a threat. When Maya peeked into his office, he smiled faintly. Couldn't sleep? She shook her head and sat beside him. Do you think we're doing the right thing, Dad? James looked at her, his face full of love. Absolutely. Change is hard, Maya. It makes people uncomfortable. But that's how we know it's working. She nodded, her father's words giving her strength. No matter how loud the opposition grew, they would keep fighting. Because the fight was bigger than them. It was about justice. It was about truth. And they wouldn't stop until they won. The lawsuit was now fully in motion, and with it came mounting pressure on the police department and the entire town. The media attention had grown larger than anyone anticipated. National networks aired segments dissecting every detail of Maya's case, civil rights organizations issued statements of support, and well-known activists traveled to town to stand in solidarity with the Johnson family. But not everyone welcomed the spotlight. Inside the walls of the police department, the mood was tense. Officer Daniels sat in his captain's office, his face red with frustration. This is getting out of hand, sir. I've got people calling my house. My kids are being harassed at school. Captain Harris, a gruff man in his 50s, sighed and leaned back in his chair. We're handling it, Daniels. You just need to keep your head down. Daniels slammed his hand on the desk. Why don't you tell them we were following orders? That it was protocol? Harris leveled a sharp gaze at him. Because no one's listening to that anymore, Daniels. This case has turned political, and people are watching. Just sit tight and let us take care of it. Daniels leaned back in his chair, jaw tight. I didn't sign up for this. No one did, Harris muttered under his breath. Meanwhile, the Johnson household was busy preparing for the upcoming court proceedings. Maya, with the help of Regina Lawson, was readying herself for the grueling questions she would face on the stand. You need to be calm and clear when you testify, Regina advised her during one of their prep sessions. The defense will try to rattle you. They'll twist your words and paint you as unreliable. Maya frowned. Why do they get to do that? I'm telling the truth. Regina smiled faintly. Because the system isn't always fair. But don't let them make you doubt yourself. You know what happened. Stick to the truth, and they won't be able to shake you. James sat quietly across the table, watching his daughter with pride. Maya was stronger than she realized. Even after everything, she had agreed to take the stand, to share her story in front of strangers who would judge her, question her, and maybe even doubt her. I'll be right there with you, James assured her. I know, Dad, Maya replied softly. We're in this together. A few days before the trial, a surprising development shook the case. Regina called James late one evening with an urgent tone in her voice. We have something big, she said. One of the officers, Miller, wants to talk. James sat up straight. Miller? One of the officers who pulled Maya out of the car? Yes. Apparently, he's been feeling the pressure and doesn't want to go down for this. He's willing to testify that Daniels acted aggressively and went beyond protocol. James ran a hand over his face, a mix of relief and disbelief washing over him. He's turning on his partner? That's what it looks like, Regina said. This could change everything. If Miller admits to misconduct, it'll shatter the department's defense. The following day, Regina arranged a private meeting with Officer Miller in her office. Miller arrived looking haggard, dark circles under his eyes, his uniform slightly disheveled. He avoided James and Maya's eyes as he sat down, fidgeting nervously. "I didn't sign up for any of this," Miller muttered, breaking the silence. "When we pulled her over, I knew something wasn't right. Daniels had a chip on his shoulder. He's been like that for years." Regina's voice was steady. "So you're saying Daniels escalated the situation unnecessarily?" Miller nodded. "Yeah, he didn't have to pull her out of the car like that." She was calm, cooperative. She didn't do anything wrong, but Daniels didn't care. He just— Miller hesitated, his voice lowering. He assumed she was trouble, because of the way she looked. Maya stiffened, her chest tightening. Even though she had known it deep down, hearing the words spoken aloud hurt. "Why are you coming forward now?" James asked, his tone measured but firm. Miller looked down at his hands. "Because I have kids, and I can't look them in the eye knowing I let something like this slide. I didn't speak up that night, but I'm speaking up now." Regina exchanged a glance with James, her expression hopeful. "This is important, Officer Miller. Your testimony could expose what really happened." Miller nodded, though he looked as though the weight of the world was on his shoulders. "I'll testify." Word of Miller's cooperation spread quickly, and the news rattled the police department. Captain Harris held an emergency meeting, furious at the betrayal. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Harris barked at Miller in front of the other officers. "You're throwing your career away." Miller stood his ground, though his voice was quieter. "I'm doing what's right. We were wrong that night, and you know it." The room fell into stunned silence. Some officers exchanged uneasy glances, while others stared coldly at Miller. The once unified wall of blue was starting to crack. The day of the trial finally arrived. Maya felt a mix of fear and determination as she entered the courtroom with her father. The room was packed, journalists with notepads, community members, activists, and even a few police officers. It felt like all eyes were on her. Regina leaned down and whispered, "You've got this, Maya. Just tell your truth." Maya nodded, taking a steadying breath. The proceedings began with opening statements. The defense painted the officers as dedicated public servants who had acted out of genuine concern for public safety. They argued that Maya's car matched the description of a stolen vehicle and that their actions were justified under the circumstances. Then it was Maya's turn to testify. As she sat on the witness stand, her heart raced. But she thought of her father and everything he had told her. Stick to the truth. She described the events of that night, the flashing lights, the officers' harsh tones, the rough way they pulled her from the car. She spoke about the fear and humiliation she felt, her voice steady even as tears welled in her eyes. "Did you do anything to provoke the officers?" Regina asked. "No," Maya replied firmly. "I didn't do anything wrong." The defense attorney tried to rattle her, asking questions designed to make her doubt herself, but Maya held her ground. When Officer Miller took the stand later that day, the courtroom was silent. His voice was steady as he described Daniel's actions, admitting that Maya had been compliant and that the situation had been escalated unnecessarily. The defense scrambled to discredit him, but the damage was done. A police officer had broken rank to tell the truth, and it sent shockwaves through the case. As the day ended, Maya felt a small flicker of hope. Her father squeezed her hand as they left the courtroom. "You did good, sweetheart," he said softly. "No matter what happens, you stood up for yourself." Maya looked up at him, her eyes filled with resolve. "We're going to win this, Dad. I can feel it." And for the first time, James believed she might be right. The truth was out now, and there was no turning back. The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation the next morning as the trial neared its conclusion. The air was thick with tension. Every seat was occupied, every face eager to see how this case would unfold. For Maya, the weight of the moment pressed against her chest, but her father's steady presence beside her grounded her. Officer Miller's testimony had shattered the department's initial narrative. By admitting that Maya had been compliant and Officer Daniels had escalated the situation unnecessarily, he'd cast doubt on the entire defense. But Daniels wasn't one to go down without a fight. When Officer Daniels took the stand that morning, the room seemed to grow colder. He sat tall, his face expressionless, as if carved from stone. Regina rose from her seat, her sharp gaze locked onto him. "Officer Daniels, can you describe your actions on the night in question?" Daniels leaned into the microphone, his voice level but curt. "As I've said, we pulled over a vehicle that matched the description of a reported stolen car. Protocol required us to ensure public safety. Is it standard protocol to forcibly remove a compliant teenager from their vehicle?" Regina pressed. Daniels narrowed his eyes slightly. "She didn't immediately comply with my instructions. That raised concerns." "Concerns based on what?" Regina's tone was razor sharp. "Her behavior or her appearance?" Daniels shifted in his seat. "Concerns based on the totality of the situation." "The totality," Regina repeated, her voice quiet but cutting. "Would you say Maya Johnson posed any threat to you that night?" Daniels hesitated just for a moment, long enough for the entire courtroom to feel it. "I couldn't take any chances." "So you assumed she was a threat?" Regina countered. "Not because of anything she did, but because of what you believed about her." Daniels clenched his jaw, his discomfort clear, but he didn't respond. Regina turned to the judge. "No further questions, Your Honor." As Daniels stepped down, the cracks in the department's defense had grown wider, but Maya knew this wasn't over yet. Outside the courthouse that afternoon, a crowd had gathered once again. News vans lined the street, and activists chanted slogans like "Justice for Maya" and "Hold them accountable." Maya and her father tried to move quickly through the crowd, but reporters swarmed them with questions. "Mr. Johnson, do you believe Officer Daniels' testimony hurt the defense?" "Maya, how do you feel seeing Daniels refuse to apologize?" James put a protective arm around his daughter as he spoke calmly into the microphones. "We're not asking for anything unreasonable. We're asking for accountability, for officers to be held to the same standards as everyone else. That's not too much to ask." Before they could push through the crowd, a familiar voice rang out from behind the cameras. "Maybe you should stop blaming the police and look in the mirror, Johnson." Maya turned to see a man in a baseball cap, his face red with anger. He was flanked by a small group of people holding signs that read, "Support our officers" and "Blue Lives Matter." "Excuse me?" James said, turning to face the man directly. "You're tearing this town apart with your lies," the man shouted. "The police were doing their jobs, and you're out here trying to ruin their lives." James took a slow breath, his voice calm but firm. "No one ruined their lives. They made a choice, and now they need to face the consequences of that choice." "Your daughter's just looking for attention," the man barked, his words venomous. Before James could respond, Maya stepped forward, her voice shaking but resolute. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said, her eyes locking onto the man. "I didn't ask to be pulled out of my car and treated like a criminal. I just wanted to go home." The man opened his mouth to retort, but the crowd around them erupted in support for Maya. Chants of "justice" drowned him out as he scowled and retreated into the crowd. James turned to Maya, his face softening with pride. "You didn't have to say anything, sweetheart." "I needed to," Maya replied quietly. "I'm tired of people blaming us for what happened." The following day marked the closing arguments of the trial. The courtroom was silent as Regina delivered her final words. "This case isn't just about Maya Johnson," she began, pacing slowly before the jury. It's about the fundamental idea that no one, no matter their age, their background, or the color of their skin, should have to fear those who are sworn to protect us. She turned to the jury, her voice ringing with conviction. Maya Johnson was calm. She was respectful. And yet she was treated with violence, suspicion, and humiliation. Not because of her actions, but because of her appearance. That is not justice. That is not acceptable. Regina paused, letting the weight of her words settle. You have the power to hold those in authority accountable, to send a message that this kind of behavior has no place in our community. Do not look away. Do not let this go unanswered. The defense's closing arguments were predictably defensive. They painted the officers as men under pressure, forced to make split-second decisions. They reiterated that Maya's car matched a description and insisted that the officers had done their jobs. But Maya could sense that something had shifted. The jury's faces were no longer impassive. Their expressions were thoughtful, their eyes lingering on her. On that evening, back at home, Maya and James sat quietly on the porch. The town felt quieter than usual, as though it too were holding its breath. Do you think we'll win? Maya asked softly, staring at the dusky sky. James looked at her, his face full of love. I don't know, but I do know we've done everything we could. No matter what happens, you were brave, Maya. You stood up for yourself, and for what's right. Maya nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. I'm glad we fought. So am I, James said, wrapping an arm around her. As the stars began to emerge, Maya felt a strange calm settle over her. The fight wasn't over, not yet, but she knew deep down that something had already changed. She had spoken her truth, and the world had listened. Tomorrow, they would find out if justice would listen too. The courthouse was more crowded than ever. Journalists, activists, community members, and Maya's family filled the wooden pews, waiting for the jury to deliver their decision. Maya sat beside her father, her hands clammy as she wrung them together. James placed a calming hand on hers, his strength steadying her. You okay? He whispered softly. Maya nodded faintly, but the truth was, her heart was racing. The fight had been long, exhausting, and full of painful moments, yet this was the culmination of it all. A decision would be made today. Would the jury see the truth? Would they believe her story? At the front of the room, the jury filed in. Each member looked solemn, as though they carried the weight of the world on their shoulders. The judge called the court to order, his voice ringing loud and clear. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict? The forewoman, a middle-aged woman with short hair and a determined expression, stood. We have, Your Honor. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Maya stared straight ahead, trying to keep her breathing steady as the forewoman spoke. In the matter of Johnson versus the City Police Department regarding claims of unlawful detention and racial profiling, we find in favor of the plaintiff, Maya Johnson. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed immediately by cheers from Maya's supporters. Tears welled in Maya's eyes as she gripped her father's hand tightly. We did it, she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. Dad, we did it. James nodded, his own eyes glassy with emotion. No, you did it. You stood up, and you won. The judge rapped his gavel to quiet the room, and the forewoman continued. We further recommend that the police department implement mandatory racial bias training and independent oversight for all officer misconduct investigations. The courtroom erupted again, but Maya barely heard it. Relief washed over her like a wave. After weeks of anger, fear, and uncertainty, the weight on her chest lifted. The chassetri outside the courthouse, supporters cheered as Maya and James stepped to the podium for a press conference. The crowd was electric, signs reading "Justice for Maya" and "Accountability for All" waved in the air. Cameras flashed as journalists leaned forward to hear Maya speak. James took the microphone first. "This victory isn't just for my daughter. It's for everyone who has ever been unfairly judged, mistreated, or silenced. Today, the truth prevailed." He turned to Maya, his pride evident as he handed her the microphone. She looked out at the sea of faces, her voice clear and strong despite the emotions bubbling inside her. "I didn't ask for any of this," Maya began. "But when it happened, I knew I couldn't stay silent. I stood up because I didn't want anyone else to feel what I felt that night. Afraid, humiliated, and invisible. We're all human, and we all deserve to be treated with respect." She paused, gathering herself as tears threatened to fall. "This isn't just about me. This is about changing a system that's broken. I hope this is the start of something better. Not just for me, but for all of us." The crowd erupted into applause, and Maya stepped back into her father's embrace, feeling both overwhelmed and empowered. The days that followed brought a sense of hope and healing to the community. The police department, under immense public pressure, announced a new set of reforms. Mandatory racial bias training for all officers, independent investigations of misconduct, and increased community oversight. Officer Daniels resigned from his position under scrutiny, his legacy now tainted by his actions. Maya's story had become more than just a local issue. It was now a symbol of accountability, justice, and change. Civil rights organizations cited her case as a turning point, and schools across the country used it as an example of standing up against injustice. At school, Maya noticed the shift. Students who had once whispered about her now approached her with respect and admiration. Teachers, too, looked at her with pride, using her story as a lesson in courage and perseverance. One afternoon, Maya sat with her best friend, Aaliyah, on the school steps. "You're kind of famous now," Aaliyah teased, nudging her playfully. Maya laughed softly, shaking her head. "I don't feel famous. I'm just me." "Well, you change things, Maya. That's pretty amazing." Maya smiled, her heart full. For the first time in weeks, the world felt a little lighter. One evening, Maya and her father sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in warm shades of orange and purple, peaceful and calm. "You proud of yourself?" James asked, breaking the quiet. Maya looked at him, a small smile on her lips. "Yeah, I think I am." James nodded, a proud grin spreading across his face. "You should be. You turned something painful into something powerful. Not many people can do that." Maya looked out at the street, where kids rode their bikes and neighbors waved from across the road. Things weren't perfect. There was still work to be done. But this was a beginning. "Do you think things will really change, Dad?" she asked quietly. James sighed, his expression thoughtful. "Change is slow, Maya. But every fight, every voice, every step moves us forward. You planted a seed, and that's how it starts." Maya nodded, letting his words settle over her. She thought of the people who had supported her, the ones who had doubted her, and the others who still didn't understand. It wasn't her job to fix everything, but she had done her part. She had spoken her truth. "Thanks for believing in me, Dad," she said softly. James smiled, his voice gentle. "I'll always believe in you, Maya. Always." The sky darkened, stars beginning to scatter across the night. Maya leaned back in her chair, feeling the cool breeze on her face. She thought back to the night it all began, to the flashing lights and the fear that had gripped her heart. She wasn't afraid anymore. The fight for justice was far from over, but Maya knew now that her voice mattered. And as long as she had her father by her side, she would never stop fighting for what was right. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet hum of the evening, Maya felt something she hadn't in weeks: peace and hope.